Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Podium. I have Katy Hamilton here with me today. Hi Katy, welcome to Off the Podium.
Hey, nice to be here.
We'll start with one thing that interested me right away when reading about you was your studies on Brahms, and was that also your dissertation?
That was my PhD, yeah. I did a PhD at the Royal College of Music, graduated in 2012, and it was about Brahms's music for vocal ensembles with piano.
Huh. You know, as a conductor, I know about his symphonies, but I feel terrible, but I don't know too much about his vocal music. So a little bit about your interest in that particularly and why you chose to do that in the first place.
Okay. Well, actually, the kind of pieces I was writing about, a lot of people don't know about them, which is one of the reasons why I got to do a PhD on them, which was great. But I first came across... So this is not solo songs. Brahms wrote a lot of solo songs, and there is a reasonable amount of literature on those.
Uh-huh.
The music I was looking at was for 4 solo for piano, so soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and then piano accompaniment. And I came across them first when I was doing my undergraduate degree at Nottingham University in music, and I was playing for the university choir. And the first year I was there, one of the programs that was put together involved a lot of music by Schubert and Schumann and Brahms. Uh-huh. For 4 voices and piano. We were singing big choir, but the score's just TV and piano. And I didn't know them at all, and I like Brahms' solo piano music. I played that at school, but I didn't know any of this repertoire, and I really fell in love with it. And at the point that I came to write my master's dissertation, I thought it would be interesting to see what material there, specifically on the Brahms pieces. And I wrote my master's dissertation, and as I was writing it thinking, it's fine, I'll find the 10 books that are written on this thing, and then I can draw on all that information. I discovered that there weren't, in fact, 10 books on this. There was, kind of one book and a couple of short chapters and articles, and that was it. And I was very lucky that at Nottingham there was an emeritus professor who was a Brahms scholar, and he let me use his library and gave me access to all the latest research at the time. And I said to him, there's kind of nothing here. I think maybe there's a PhD in this, and I'd already thought I wanted to do further study. And he said, there's totally a PhD in this. So he put me in touch with some Brahms scholars in Germany who were editing the new Brahms complete edition for Händler. And I took a year out, and I went to live in Germany for 6 months in Schleswig-Holstein, where they're based, in Kiel University. And they let me use a library at that point of these Brahms pieces, these vocal quartets with piano. And I spent 6 months having a brilliant time, getting my German better, going to lectures, playing for their choir, actually, amongst other things. And then I came back and went to London and did my PhD on these pieces. So we made a recording as part of the PhD with some students from the college of vocal quartets with piano by Brahms' lesser-known contemporaries. There are already commercially available recordings of the Brahms pieces, but there weren't of all these kind of spin-offs. When Brahms' pieces made it big, lots of his friends decided they were going to write their own pieces in the same style, and most of those haven't been recorded. So we made a CD, and I wrote my thesis, and that's what I submitted to be a doctor.
This is completely off topic, but you've studied a lot of Brahms. Do you know anything about the Schumanns and Brahms that most people wouldn't know about, that you've come across in your research?
Do I know things most people wouldn't know about? Well, I don't know. What would most people know about?
I want to know specifically about the Schumann and Brahms relationships, both Robert and Clara Schumann and Brahms. Anything that we wouldn't know?
It's tricky. It's a big controversial subject, particularly Brahms and Clara.
Yeah,
of course. Controversial subject. And,
that's why I'm asking.
And it's also a subject that fiction writers and filmmakers have a lot of fun with. There are some really amazing, in all senses of the word, books and films about Brahms and the Schumanns. Yeah. Some of which are very good, some of which are hilarious and historically nonsense, but still kind of entertaining. I think the big thing is that we don't know. We don't have categorical, in our hand bits of paper evidence that there was anything romantically going on between Clara and Brahms, or indeed Robert and Brahms. We don't have any information about any of that. What we do have is letters that certainly were in the early 1900s, when Brahms' biography was first taking off in a big way, letters that were suppressed and which have subsequently only been published in the last 20, 30 years, that certainly prove that Brahms was in love with Clara, but whether or not that was reciprocated and whether anything happened is entirely down to speculation. We know that Clara had other lovers after Schumann had died. At least one, another composer, a man called Theodor Kirchner, who'd been part of the Schumann Circle in the 1850s. Well, but it's easily the stuff of the steamy romance novel. And actually, at the moment, I'm co-editing a book with my doctoral supervisor, Natasha Logis, for Cambridge University Press about Brahms in his historical context. And she and I are writing a chapter on myth-making. So we are looking quite specifically at both the fiction and the film stuff that's been brought out around the Brahms story, and it tends to focus on Brahms's relationship with the Schumanns, and also the myths that turn up in the biography, and how much of these things can be pinned down and how much of them are just speculative.
You have a tough position as a musicologist, as a writer, to bring light to these things, and it's such an interesting place to be, because you want to get some information where it'll excite the audiences that read your writings, but at the same time you have to be historically accurate. It's really tough.
Well, I think it's a mistake to think that that musicology is a dirty word, and actually it's funny because my own reaction to being called a musicologist has changed a lot over time. I used to be really resistant to the idea of being a musicologist because, musicologists, as I think it was Thomas Beecham said, a musicologist is a man who can't play. He can hear music, but he can't play it. The idea of sort of having the ologies is kind of slightly disparaging. If you could actually play a musical instrument, well, why would you be wasting your time with all of these dusty books and things? And I kind of own the word musicologist now more than I ever did, but I think the notion that just because you happen to be only looking at historical is completely wrong. And after all, certainly one of the things that fascinates me about music history, and not just about Brahms, because although my specialism is Brahms, because I'm now freelance, I'm writing about 300-400 years worth of music history. I could be doing anything one week to the next. Is that it's the history of people, right? People are really interesting, and people make these amazing works of art. People who might love them or hate them, and a lot of what I think I consider my job to be now, writing program notes or CD notes or giving pre-concert talks, it's sort of door opening. It's opening the door to an audience, whether they are already familiar with some of the history of a piece or whether they're completely new to it, and sort of showing them a bit how this thing came about, that just because we happen to generally hear the sort of music I'm writing about in a relatively neutral, purpose-built space of a concert hall where we all sit quietly and get shouted at if we rustle our sweet papers and all of that, that doesn't take away from the fact that this was a vibrant and wonderful thing that was created by a human being, possibly for their best friends. Maybe there was a big argument. Maybe the premiere was a disaster. Maybe they had to change stuff. Maybe the publisher hated it. Maybe the publisher printed it and it was full of wrong notes and they had to try again. Maybe there was a big copyright scandal. There's all kinds of exciting things that I can dig out, and I think it's bringing history to life in the best sense of that. Means that you can have fun and tell stories. What I do is basically tell stories. It's just I try and tell stories based on the best available factual material, so that I'm not leading people up the garden path.
Yeah. Well, this is all great stuff. Another thing that came to my eyes when I was reading about you was the post-1945 Britain and the immigrants involved in music.
Yeah, so I was involved when I was still at the college. I was involved with a big project there called Singing a Song in a Foreign Land. And it was specifically a project about emigre musicians who'd come mostly from Austro-Germany to England during or just after the Second World War. And there was a big conference, and there are various website pages that have been built since, and connections up to other universities around the continent that have been working on emigre musicians and their histories. And the thing that I ended up looking at was the foundation of the Edinburgh Festival, because a lot of the musicians and administrators who were involved in setting it up were not British. They had come over to the UK either just before war had broken out or actually managed to escape and use false passports and so on to actually get across here and survive. And, the number of emigre musicians who end up playing a major role in British musical life as a result of that big shift. A whole bunch of them go to the States, of course. You have, lots of people trying to make their money there. But also there's quite a few people who end up in Britain and they get university appointments, they go and work for the BBC, they take over conducting opera companies, they set up the Edinburgh Festival and so on. And it's fascinating. I mean, multiculturalism is not new, as we all know.
Yeah.
And it was a very interesting time. I was very specifically working just on that project, and it was a few years ago now, so I have to kind of rack my brains to get back the specific details. But it was really interesting to dig into that, to go through all of the papers at the National Library of Scotland, where they have all the early years of the festival, all the letters and memos and internal minutes and all of that. And also, when we had this big conference at the RCM, there were a number of people who either had worked with these emigre musicians very closely, were their children, or indeed, in one or two cases, were musicians who had themselves ended up travelling to the UK and were still here. And the most famous is probably Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, of the now great Wallfisch musical dynasty, performance dynasty, who was rescued when she was a very small child from, I think it was Belsen, one of the concentration camps. And she was there, and it was wonderful to have her there and to be able to see her interviewed, and as indeed she is a great deal. But yeah, it was a really interesting experience to see how much that shift came to shape British musical culture of the last 60, 70 years.
Yeah. How does it feel to live in a world now that you've almost studied from the past? Things are constantly shifting and people moving around from place to place. And do you see a big wave of musicians that are coming to UK? Because I know, as an Armenian living in the United States, my parents also immigrants. I mean, I myself am too, because I was actually born in Armenia. There's a lot of Armenian musicians that live and work in the States. How does it feel to be in the UK and people moving around, a lot of people coming in? Does it almost seem like it's something you've covered as a music historian, as a musicologist?
I'm not sure it's something I've done, aside from that very specific project that I've done so much research on as a kind of focus study myself, but certainly particularly at the RCM, which is a very, very international place. And I think the conservatoires in particular really have a very broad international remit. I think that the RCM has students from something like 50 different nationalities. Wow. And I also, at the moment, I'm doing some teaching at Middlesex University. Middlesex has direct students that join in their third year from Malaysia and also from India. So that means that the student body, as I'm teaching them, is usually at least 3 different nationalities, plus any other students that might have come from elsewhere in the EU or indeed from further afield. So the student body is getting increasingly cosmopolitan, and that can be so interesting. I remember when I first started my PhD, the very first meeting that the doctoral students had, there were, about 15 of us, I think, who started together. And we all just sat in a seminar room, and the head of the doctoral program introduced themselves and then said, maybe we could go around the room and say who you are, where you're from, and what you're studying. And we basically ended up spending the entire 2 hours talking about how we got to where we were, because it turned out that most of the other people in the room were not from the UK. And we had students who'd been through the education system in Italy, in Canada, in the States, in Cyprus. And the way in which music education is structured in all of those countries, the path through degrees and conservatoires and the way our institutions fit together and so on, is really different.
Yeah.
So certainly it was part of the learning experience as a PhD student, getting to know how those education systems work elsewhere. Yeah. And it means, as a teacher, that I do have to think much more about how much I can assume my students know about Western European history, for example, if half of them have never been to Western Europe before. Which is interesting because my undergrad course was largely British students, and it was possible to assume that a certain level of knowledge about European history or about the religious situation in perhaps France, Germany, Austria, and Britain, that we would be familiar enough with Christian stories, biblical stories that we had in common, and those assumptions are no longer assumptions that you can keep in place if you're teaching a much more a broader and international mixed group. And that's fascinating as a teacher, to try and work out how you gauge what your students already know, and then how much information it's reasonable to expect them to pick up, and then how you can build on that to get round to the musical historical situations you're talking about.
But it also makes it tough in a way. I mean, I know it's fascinating, and you yourself as a teacher learn a lot from these experiences, but it must be tough because you want to be as natural in the way you speak and the examples you give, but at the same time, you realize, whether it's in the moment or when you're preparing a lesson plan or the lesson of the day or the week, to not say things that might be unrecognizable or not clear enough for the students who are not from that culture.
It is tough, but I think the big thing that I would say is what I hope I encourage in my students, and this is partly helped by the fact that most of the groups I'm teaching are pretty small, so there is the opportunity for real dialogue. It's not like I'm standing in front of a lecture hall of 200 people. Is the opportunity to ask. So if I make an assumption, and of course I try wherever possible to flag up in advance things that I think are going to be are unlikely to be part of their general knowledge. But if I make an assumption and it turns out that it's unfair to make that assumption, I encourage my students always to ask me what I'm talking about. And it doesn't matter whether I'm teaching 18-year-olds or whether I'm teaching adult education classes, which I also do at City Lit, which is an adult education, further education college in central London. If people don't know, I want them to feel like they can ask. I never want it to be a situation where either from a fact-based perspective or indeed from just an opinion-based perspective, they don't feel they can chip in. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot over the last few months, because one of the courses I teach each year at Middlesex, and which I've also in fact been teaching at City Lit this year, is it's basically a general 19th century music course, and we start with Beethoven and we go through to Schoenberg. And there are sessions that fall in the late spring, early summer that you could broadly put under the umbrella of nationalism and Orientalism. So how do you talk about some of the operatic subject matter that's being used by French and Italian composers in the second half of the 19th century, which is entirely based on stereotypes of places that a lot of them have never been, in a way that allows the people in the class who might actually be from those places to not feel like they are being misrepresented or marginalised. So we talk a lot about that, and whether it's Madame Butterfly or Lakme or Samson and Delilah or Rimsky-Korsakov's depictions of the Orient, that kind of thing. We talk a lot about what national identity means and about defining national styles in opposition and that kind of thing. So I try wherever possible to encourage dialogue, because the Sanson never went to some of the places that the music of which he's trying to copy, and that's fine, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't have the chance to have a chat about if he had been aiming for a more realistic depiction, what he might have done. And it may be that the students in the room know far more about that than I do, because they're from those places.
The way you speak about music and the way you explain, I wish I had a teacher like you to talk to me about music history.
Thank you.
Because it's so interesting and exciting with the comparisons, whether it's musical relations or non-musical, whether it's the history of the world, how it connects to the music. I love the way you're explaining things, and it's really fascinating. But I do have a question about a little bit different from this research. You consider yourself a freelance musician, am I correct?
That's right. Yep.
In today's world, especially in the US, it's tough, and I'm sure around the world too, for musicians to make a living, and it's always sort of been that way. What do you suggest to young musicians who are out there trying to make a career as a freelancer, and you've been so successful doing that with your pre-concert talks, with teaching, and everything else that you're doing? How do you piece together a freelance career?
Wow, if I had the answer to that question, I'd be a millionaire.
You're doing really well with that. So,
well, I think the kind of freelancing I do is a bit different from a freelancer who's primarily working as an instrumentalist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in that field there is a tremendous amount of competition.
Yeah.
Because the majority of very talented performers or composers end up spending at least half of their week looking for some kind of secure employment. Now, that might be that they are fortunate enough to get a place in a permanent place in an orchestra,
yeah,
and they then supplement their income doing something else. But it may be that they spend 3 days a week teaching school children,
yeah,
which they may or may not enjoy.
Yeah, yeah.
In order that they can then spend the rest of their week doing other things. I mean, actually, going back to your question about internationalism, I think the UK has been for several hundred years a place where, because of the economic structure, freelancing and sort of impresario type work actually has been something that took off in a way that it took a bit longer, and indeed sometimes is still not possible in other countries on the continent. So you get Haydn coming to London in the 1790s,
mm-hmm.
and he's able to make money rather than having to just work for a single family, single dude.
Yeah.
He gets together with Salomon and they put on concerts and they split the profits, and there's some kind of feasible commercial model there.
Yeah.
And I think the UK system allows for that, has allowed for that in a way that particularly some other countries in Europe haven't so much.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of how you find the work, I think the big thing really is just to talk to people as much as possible. And again, this is another reason why, for performers and composers, as well as for musicologists, a place like a conservatoire or a university or conferences or whatever are brilliant opportunity spots, because they're your opportunity to start talking to people and find out what they do, and whether there's a project you could do together, or whether you could set up an ensemble together, or whether somebody knows of a festival that they performed in last year and they had a really great time and they've got the email address of the organizer, so that you can write and see whether or not they might be prepared to employ you.
Mm-hmm.
My freelance work, so I went freelance 3 years ago this summer, and I was on the staff of the RCM. I joined the staff after I'd finished my PhD, and I had always thought that being a university lecturer was what I wanted, and years of various degrees and collecting various bits of paper, with the aim of getting an academic job, which is itself a thing that's getting harder and harder to do, because a lot of universities are now, and this I know is the same in the States as it is in the UK, cutting down on the number of tenured staff.
Exactly.
And relying increasingly on hourly pay. So actually getting any job security in academia is getting harder anyway.
Yeah.
And I got the job. I got a job at the college. It was a permanent job, and it was half of the week. And it was enough to live on, and it was a great place to work. But I started to think that actually the thing I most loved about the things I was doing at the college was the work where I had an opportunity to speak to a broader audience
mm-hmm.
than just the academic sphere for conference papers and the student body. I like talking to the general public about music. I like finding ways of communicating with as broad an audience as I can. And I was already writing some program notes, so I already had some contacts that way. And I'd met a lot of interesting people at the college, and I'd been presenting at conferences, so I had friends at other universities. And I thought, well, I've got some savings. If it all goes horribly wrong, then I will find some other work and see.
Yeah.
And I quit my job at the college and had already lined up a bit of work. A lot of the rest of it was a combination of luck.
Yeah.
Not going to lie, there was a degree of luck. Middlesex was luck. They phoned me the week before the autumn term started that year and said, we're desperately looking for somebody to teach 19th century music. There's a member of staff here who met you at an event 4 years ago for about 5 minutes and seemed to remember that you were a 19th century music person. And I've been on their staff ever since. And then I wrote to people I knew in the business and said, is there any advice you can give me? I made a list of music festivals and wrote to their organisers and said, this is what I do. Is there anything I could usefully do for you? Could I write notes or give a talk? I had a contact who put me in touch with BBC Radio 3, and they then contacted me, and I've done some work for them. So it's really just about talking to people.
Yeah.
And I think the more Catholic your tastes are and the more things you're curious about, the more likely you are to get work. Because if you narrow your specialism down right from the get-go and say, well, I'm only going to be a soloist, or I'm only going to play string quartets, or I'm only prepared to write about music between 1800 and 1850, then you are effectively professionally shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah.
Whereas if you say, if you look at your toolbox of skills and go, I know how to speak to a public gathering, and I know how to research, and I know how to work library systems, and I know how to deal with online resources, therefore I know basically how you go about researching something, then you can broaden the remit of the time period of things you're prepared to read about or talk about, and you learn as you go. I learn every week. No 2 weeks in my job now are the same, and I love that. I love the fact that I'm always getting to learn something new and do something new.
In music, you find a lot of people, well, at least from my experiences, that really specialize in things, and they're so great, musicians who are violinists, maybe they specialize in the music after the 1950s, or a particular composer. So the 21st century, to really make it happen for most of us, maybe we should have various interests and things that are, we know how to do well in different spheres and in different areas, and you show that it's possible to do it. I loved your blog, and how did this blog idea come about? And I particularly like the one about George Orwell's 1984, and that what you called it the National Endowment for Thinking.
Because I'd reread 1984 over Christmas, and as I said in the blog, one of the most terrifying things that I think he does in that book is show what it means to live without history. Yeah. And without history, you have no gravity, you have no groundwork or foundation or anything, and it's utterly terrifying. So the blog started just before I left the college. I thought, I need to get a decent website sorted out. I already had a website, but it was a bit naff. So I thought, okay, redo the website properly. Let's learn how to use WordPress and really sort this out. And I was looking around at other websites by academics and musicians that I knew were freelance, to see what kind of thing they did. And I joined Twitter, and I thought, okay, I need to do something. Clearly, the catch here with something like Twitter is to be on it. You need a reason to be on it and contacting people and saying things. So maybe I could write a blog. And then I thought, okay, how often am I going to do this? Because I have to make this realistic. If I'm trying to write a post every day, then that's not going to work. Yeah. So I thought, okay, well, maybe let's try once a week. Let's see what topics I might end up writing about. And I think I did make a list to start with of things that I might end up writing about. And actually, partly because I keep an eye on the news, and partly because every week is different, and partly because in cases of dire emergency, I do still have a list of things that I've not yet written about. Yeah. I don't find it difficult to find something every week to write about, and they're very varied. If you've looked at it, you will have seen that they really do run the gamut from sort of the blog that I wrote yesterday, which was about a project I was involved in last week, conducting a contemporary dance piece at Middlesex University. First time I've ever conducted anything that's involved working with dancers, and it was really interesting. Yeah. Through to advice pieces on if you're freelance and you're being asked to work for free, then how do you respond to that? To general musings on things in the news, to me getting angry about certain political decisions, like the decisions around National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. I think the very first post I did was to do with the furore at Glyndebourne in 2014 over the Rosencavalier production that was put on that year, when a number of major music critics made very disparaging comments about the physical appearance of one of the singers. So it's really been very varied, and I try to make them kind of conversational and not too long, and something that is of relatively broad interest, although the audience that I'm aiming for, I guess, is everybody from people who are generally interested in classical music and indeed the arts in general, through to more specifically research students or freelancers or people who are taking their first steps into a career in research, because those are the people that I know, and those are the people I figure are most likely to actually read the thing.
Well, yeah, it was really interesting, and I didn't realize that the article that you wrote, the best foot forward, was you just wrote that yesterday. It's been great talking with you, Katy, getting to know you. Anything that we missed that you want to teach us or share with us?
Anything I want to teach you? Wow, I don't think so. I mean, I guess one of the things that this year has been, I guess in the last 12 months, has been particularly interesting for me is that for the first time, I've been working more with, or had the opportunity to talk to, living composers. Mm-hmm. And I made a big joke of this when I was asked to interview James Macmillan at an event last summer, by saying, they don't usually let me near the live ones, because mostly I'm hanging out in the 19th century and they're all firmly dead and I can't upset them. And then I interviewed Mark Anthony Turnage last month for an event in London, which was really interesting, and I have another composer interview coming up in the summer with Sally Beamish, and it's been so great to just be kind of eclectic right up to the present day. So I guess the general thing I would throw out to anybody who's interested in music at all is just keep listening and be as curious as you can. Dig around and find the most obscure things at the bottom of Spotify. And it doesn't have to be an 18th century divertimento in order for it to count as, inverted commas, real music. I had a couple of people come up to me recently and they were talking to me about the music I was researching, and they said slightly tentatively, "Do you like musicals?" As if I was about to say, "Good gracious, what nonsense you're talking." And I said, "Of course I like musicals. I love musicals. I can recite entire Disney films and all of the songs as well." So, be curious and explore and find music that you love, wherever that is, and don't ever stop listening or finding new stuff. That's the key to really enjoying music and the arts in general.
Yeah, well, since you said that, it made me think about asking you for some suggestions, whether it's for me or just the people that will listen. What do you suggest? What's on your playlist now? What's the last thing you've listened to recently?
What's on my playlist? Well, a bunch of things. I'm doing a talk on Saturday on Dvorak, Schubert, Messiaen and Brahms. Mm-hmm. So I've been revisiting Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, which I'm talking about next weekend. I'm also doing some work at the moment listening to some Sondheim shows, because I'm going to be doing a talk in the autumn on Sunday in the Park with George.
Oh, that's great.
Lots of Sally Beamish, because I'm going to be interviewing her very soon. And then very recently discovered, in fact in the last week discovered, the songs of a wonderful British female composer of the early 20th century called Muriel Herbert, who a friend recommended to me, and she set, I think it is all British poetry, some contemporary with her, so she set James Joyce, and indeed she met Joyce, and also Elizabethan poetry, Shakespeare as well, and they're really beautiful and not a composer I'd come across before. So quite an eclectic mix, but that's half the fun of it. Oh, and I'm also teaching a class on Scandinavian music on Thursday, so we've got some Nielsen, Sibelius, and some Grieg in there in the mix as well.
A few questions I have left. First one: what inspires you to do the work that you do?
What inspires me? I think knowing how many fantastic things there are out there and how much stuff I don't know yet. I'm a really voracious reader of fiction as well, and I'm sort of dabbling in writing fiction too. So I spend a lot of time that I'm not listening to music or reading about music, just reading fiction.
Yeah.
And I love how many different ways there are to look at the world, whether that's through music or painting or sculpture or literature or poetry, and how amazing, because the world is such an amazing thing. There are so many, from nature to people to buildings to landscapes, whatever it is.
Yeah.
The fact that those things are there, that those things have inspired people, that other people have inspired those people, and they've come up with all this stuff. I mean, life's never going to be long enough. I'm never going to run out of things that are going to be interesting to go away and around in.
And lastly, my favorite question is what you do outside of music, if there's time to do other things.
I walk. I do a lot of quite long walks when I can, and I read a lot. What else do I do? I'm a big fan of chocolate, so anybody who wants to hang out with me and come and eat cake or chocolate is always very much welcome. I spend a lot of time with my friends, just having big, ridiculous conversations about everything from what's on the TV to do you believe in God?
Yeah.
And
so should we talk about the do you believe in God together?
Do I believe in God?
I'm
Do
kidding.
you want to get into this? We could be here for another hour.
Yeah, well, no, it's really been great chatting with you about all these things, and if there's anything else you want to add, you're welcome to do that now.
I can't think of anything else for the moment, unless you've got any other specific questions.
No specific questions. It was just great to get to know you and learn from you. I mean, part of this project is to learn from people who are way better at what they do than I am. So it's great to listen to people who know what they're doing and learn from them, and also record it and have it out there for people who want to listen to these and learn from them as well. So thank you.
I think there's nothing greater than having the chance to overhear other people's conversations.
Yeah,
because we get to do it. We get to do it for free via lots of cool recording software. That's even better.
Yeah.
But, I was at a festival last weekend, and I was asked to chair some in conversations, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so interesting because there are 2 or 3 people in each panel. Everyone's got their own perspective on something, and the audience effectively just sat there eavesdropping.
Yeah.
Whilst we had a nice chat, and it's amazing what comes up that you've never thought about, either as somebody in the conversation or somebody listening.
Yeah.
If you have the chance to do that. So I listen to a couple of podcasts quite religiously, and they tend to be conversation podcasts.
Yeah.
Because I think they're kind of more fun than just having one person talking to you.
Yeah,
directly.
yeah. No, this is great, and hopefully we'll have you back at some point. And now that we know each other a little bit, I think the conversation will flow differently. And I've said this about a few people now, because it's great the first time you talk to a person, but it gets even better the next time you meet them, because you're already at a certain place and you know things about that person, so you want to further discuss and talk about other things that come up. So it's it's been great, and it's great that I have so many people in the UK that somehow I managed to meet, and it went from Des Oliver to Ian Pace to various other people, and it just kind of built from there. And I've been talking to quite a few of my friends in the US, and they're surprised that I don't have any of the US people yet on, even though it's coming up.
I was going to say that's going to be your next priority.
Yeah, well, it's in the works.
That's fab. It's really great. So is that why you started the podcast? Was just to kind of just to have some conversations with some people? Yeah,
basically, and also because there's things that frustrated me in the world of music in general, growing up, from master classes being super expensive to the role of a conductor, and how I think some of the major conductors are overpaid and they don't work enough, and various other things that have frustrated me, specific to my field. And I just wanted to talk about those, and then it somehow turned into just inviting people and talking to them about it. So that's about it. And now it's more of a chat than, I haven't done one of the ones that I do by myself in a long time. So hopefully at some point I'll bring that back on and talk about some things that frustrate me, I guess, about the world of music. But no, it's great, and it's nice to chat to people who are really doing amazing things in their career.
Well, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Katy. Have a nice day. A good night, I think. It's night in England. And
getting towards the evening.
Yeah.
It's still sun, so that's okay.
And this will be the 20th podcast, so I was happy to have you on. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much, Tigran.